And this paper detailed how the CIA's mind control program, MKUltra, was not stopped in 1973, as the CIA had told Congress.
Hey, welcome to No Way Jose. Today we are joined by William Ramsey. This is completely coincidental. This is dropping on a Friday the 13th, but today we're talking about Aleister Crowley. Pleasure to have you with us today, William. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me. Good
Yeah,
to be
yeah.
with you again.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. I've been seeing you've been having Austin on quite a bit, so it's kind of cool to see you guys palling around. My old co-host, but here we are today talking about Crowley. You've written a couple books on him. I thought it was only the one, but I guess you wrote another one. Was it The Children of the Beast? I forget what you said the second one was. So that one is more, I guess, about his legacy and his followers. So I'm looking forward to this conversation today. I guess probably a good place to start, because in these parapolitics circles, I feel like we talked about this a little bit before we started. It's all too common that he comes up and it's just kind of brought up as like assumed people know what they're talking about. But it's just almost just like people are too scared to admit they don't. And I have no problem admitting it. I think the extent of my looking into Crowley is I believe it was last podcast on the left. I listened to their series a while back, and it was like something in the realm of 10-ish hours. It was pretty good. It was entertaining. It was a good little. I feel like there might have been some things I missed, in which obviously you maybe you would agree if you listened to it as well. I'm not sure. Yeah. So we're getting into that today. So with Crowley, I guess a good place to start is kind of who is he? Kind of set time, like the setting where he's from. Just start there, basics, and then we'll kind of work up.
Yeah, I used to have a superficial understanding of Crowley too. When I was growing up, there was an Ozzy Osbourne song, Mr. Crowley. I had no idea who he was. We used to sing that song when we were in our teens, but knew nothing. So I didn't know much about Crowley. I was led back to Crowley from my research in 9/11. But it turned out through my research like this kind of, they always called him a dabbler, but he really wasn't. He really was probably the most influential, certainly the most influential occultist of the modern era. He was born in 1875 near Stratford-on-Avon, kind of in central western UK, or England, I should say, and died in 1947. So he was 72. And he was the only son of a very wealthy family. The Crowley family sold beer and also sandwiches and other items through the British pub system. So he was a child of wealth. He also was born into a family that were Christians, but they were part of kind of a subsect. They were called the Exclusive Brethren, and they were influenced by Darby. People who know theology, Darby was kind of the inventor of dispensationalism. Ooh. Kind of some people dispute how Christian he was or whether he was involved in the occult himself, which is a whole nother show. But I think that influenced Crowley a lot. He had they only were allowed to read the Bible. He only associated with other members of the Exclusive Brethren or Plymouth Brethren. And he eventually rebelled against it. His father died at 12. It affected him immensely. He really liked his father. So he was left in the hands of his mother and his uncle, who he really hated his uncle. But he was a child of privilege. So he was sent to private schools. We would call them private schools in the States. They would call them public schools in the UK. And they were very rough, almost like something out of you would see from Pink Floyd's The Wall, really brutal. He literally almost died. So they pulled him out after fighting and all kinds of stuff. And he was in the care of private tutors. But that was when he was in his kind of teens. That was his experience going to Cambridge. So then eventually he applied to Cambridge and got in and attended school there. And it was while he was in that college that he was amongst it was almost like a Harry Potter-esque kind of environment.
Real quick, but before I let this go, I'm just kind of curious. I mean, maybe this has perked my ears up. Do you think that that schooling experience was just a product of his time, or do you think there might have been something more sinister going on there? Because obviously, anytime we're dealing with an influential figure, especially a cult, whatever, and then you see trauma at a young age in some sort of weird, isolated environment, it kind of puts up feelers and makes you wonder, is something weird going on here?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it's just, I could also see it just being a product of his time in the early 1900s.
No, I think that's a really good question, because he was born into really the apex of the British Empire, when the British Empire ruled the world almost. Quarter of the landmass, and it's before World War One, so that the kind of decline of the British Empire was from World War One, and World War Two pretty much put an end to it. At least it's overt land ownership. But I think that he was born into the system and very class conscious. So we have class here in the United States. It's not really spoken, but in England at that time, in the late 19th century, is very class conscious. You were part of a rigid system. There was no questioning it. If you were in the upper class, you were going to private schools, hanging out with your own friends. And those public schools there, that they call them public schools, are really private schools here in the States. They were the training grounds for the people who were going to run the empire. So even it's kind of interesting, because as Crowley is coming up, he goes to school with the future king, right? So it's King, I think, is the sixth King, Edward VI. He was the king in World War II. I think that's what it was. And also kind of in the same kind of private school environment that Churchill was in. Very brutal, very rough, a lot of physical violence, a lot of furtive things happening, and cold-blooded, really cold-blooded. So I think that knowing that traumatic thing where they're trying to shape you into this kind of world controller, so to speak.
Yeah,
I think that's real. I think that he was part of it.
Yeah, and those are anecdotal examples, Churchill and Crowley, but I mean both are kind of warped character. I mean, I guess maybe I'm assuming your position on Churchill here, but from my understanding of history, kind of both warped characters. I mean, obviously that might piss off some people with Churchill, but I don't know. Yeah, I mean, there's something.
They're
to
very
that.
much more similar than you might think, because they're both servers of empire.
Yeah.
Crowley, in his later life, he called himself John Sykes' dog, and that's a reference to Oliver Twist by Dickens. And Sykes was kind of the nasty character in that book, and he kicked his dog, like really, a horrible thing. But the dog stayed loyal. And so Crowley thought of himself as like a real loyalist to the royals, and really was. And later on in his life, people figured out, he was probably an intel asset from being recruited in Cambridge, and was proud. So then Churchill was, for sure. And Churchill was involved in very strange things like Crowley, where they're sent out to the all over the world. Like Churchill goes to the Boer War in South Africa and somehow escapes. He's following around. I think Kitchener was one of the guys. Crowley goes in 1904, fairly young for his age, maybe 28, 29, goes to Russia and is supposedly the head of this Good Time Girls, was a traveling show. But the whole time he's sending information back. And that was a very important time before really Russia experienced the real revolution in 1918. But there was an uprising in 1905.
All right, I didn't mean to throw you off there. I mean, we kind of went.
No, I think it's important. I think it's important for the groundwork for Crowley, because he really was never left his class, and it influenced his kind of class consciousness, influenced his religion, because he never thought of himself as a popularizer. He was not egalitarian. And later on in his writings, he will write that the feudal system is the optimal form of political systems. Like, that's a pretty intense admission. Like, I believe like the elites are supposed to rule. And he said, never have anything to do with the muck of the mire. Take the diamonds and polish them. And that's the way he was. So he was always he called himself the priest to the princes. So he was never trying to integrate people like of the lower class into his religious system. He only wanted to be amongst the elite, which was amongst his class. So it was only artists and authors and rich people and all that stuff. Those were the ones he was really operating in. So I think you see that groundwork. So anyway, he's at just to kind of go back, he's at Cambridge. He never graduates. he thought it was beneath him, so a real snob, but while he was there, he said he was interested in three things: poetry, mountain climbing, and magic. So these things, he thought, fashioned himself as kind of this he was in college, a libertine romantic poet of that era, and read a lot of like French artists, Rimbaud and some of these other characters, and started writing books. So he wrote poetry books and mountain climb. So he was traveling often. Like, it's kind of hard to keep track of him because he's moving to mountaineering sites. He spends time in Switzerland. He does climbing things in Sandy Beach, I think is Beachy Head, was in the southern part of.
And this is
UK.
post Cambridge, right?
Yeah, while he's at Cambridge too, but post Cambridge.
Okay, because my immediate thought is like, oh, how convenient times to slip off the map. So, but yeah,
well, that's the whole thing. Is that what you'll find is that he's I mean, you have to think pre-internet or pre-anything. He's writing letters all the time, so he's keeping notes, and eventually he gets kicked out of Italy, Germany, and France. So like literally gets kicked out of France and Italy on the orders of Mussolini. But anyway, so he's like mountain climbing, but he's also studying magic. What he finds is he finds this group of late 19th century, where at that time a lot of ideas from the East were coming back to Western things, and alternate views outside of like the Christian views. It almost like the late 19th century is almost like a 60s event, where you have Blavatsky and all these other characters. And he joins this group, this magical fraternity, the Order of the Golden Dawn, which is a post-Masonic order. What that means is that these people had already gone through Masonry. So then they went into this post-Masonic order. And some people, like Arthur Conan Doyle's around, the guy who wrote Sherlock Holmes. Yeats is around, who wrote a lot of poetry, is also a magician. He actually says magic is like the inspiration for his poetry. So Crowley's around them. And then he starts traveling. He actually circumnavigates the globe twice, which is really interesting. So he goes east so he's practicing magic and a magical practitioner during this whole thing.
Let's take a second, if you don't mind, and can we define what they mean by magic? Because I remember this was a part that I found to be kind of interesting when I was doing my dive into it forever ago, is the way it was defined. I believe he even was of the belief there were like two different types of magic or something along those lines, and he was a practitioner of a certain type. And if I'm correct, it's something along the lines of almost like to believe something to be true. I'll pass it off to you because I'm talking out my ass entirely. I'm just trying to see, what do they mean by when they say magic, at least Crowley particularly.
Well, I think that it would be ceremonial magic, so it would be different from like a magician. Mm-hmm. Although ceremonial magic has an element of magicianship to it. But I think he defined magic in his book as creating change in conformance with will. Okay. So that was kind of one of his famous axioms, among other, do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law, and some of these other ones.
So in a certain sense, which I guess this will maybe come into play or come into sight later for those, you mentioned 9/11, but I guess we can say deep events in general, like that could almost be a form of magic. And this is why maybe we see symbolism sometimes along these things, and it's a certain way to drive consciousness a certain way, essentially, which is in a certain way kind of is magic, I guess,
I think that's very well said. And you see similar terminology from ceremonial magic to these operations and in intel. So there is a tie. And so this is an operation. Well, when you're doing a magical working, it's like an operation too, right? Mm-hmm. So it's interesting how the terminology is even the same, really. Mm-hmm. But yeah, magic. So he was practicing ceremonial magic. So what does that mean? You get a magic book, you literally get all these implements. You have a wand, you have magical clothing, you do certain chants and rituals. You're trying to make changes, either summon, evoke, or invoke. So it's evoke from inside out, outside in, talk to entities, try to, whatever you want, money, so there's all kinds of things and he integrated all this stuff from Eastern magic, like magical I Ching sticks and things like that. So it's a whole, and you have tarot cards. So it's all these things to try to communicate with this other spiritual realm, but not through Christian means, like self. You're the center. So the magician is kind of the view is like the magician's at the center of the universe. It's really a common view, and making change is like the boss.
Yeah.
And you'll see later, it's kind of the coming together of the macrocosm and the microcosm. And both of those are symbolized by the pentagram and the hexagram, right? So the microcosm is the pentagram and the macrocosm is like the universe. And when those two come together, it's 11, which is why 11 becomes it really is the prime number of Crowley's religion, which he eventually will put together, which he calls Thelema, which is part of ceremonial magic is involved in that. And just kind of other kind of wisdom traditions that he integrated into it. So almost like a pre-L. Ron Hubbard, which there's a tie between Crowley and Hubbard.
To make another parallel between like kind of like ops, as we sort of did with like deep events, and you said the macro and the micro. I mean, maybe to kind of make this parallel again and to kind of frame it in a non-woo-woo way, if you were to say on the micro in this situation, like a ceremony amongst a group, like the order or whatever. Let's say, people, my audience knows of things like SRA. Let's say that some sort of SRA type event happens, and there's a whole ceremony and everything that goes around it. Like, yes, there is woo-woo in place, but in a very real sense, you're also forging a new reality with these people that you're with. You have essentially, and it's almost like a blood pact. Now you guys cannot betray each other. Now you guys are a group forged together to, pursue power or whatever means you have, essentially. So that might be a way to understand it, perhaps. Does that sound right to you?
Yes.
I'm just trying to conceptualize
100%.
it for myself.
I've used an example of what happens at Skull and Bones in the Tomb. That's what we know of. There's all kinds of other secret societies at Yale. This kind of new Treasury Secretary is one of the main top 3 secret societies from Yale, which should be concerning. Anything from Yale should be concerning, but when they get initiated, it's tapped, it's secrecy oaths, right? And then they are literally almost like a trauma-based mind control. They filmed the initiation rituals for the Skull and Bones men, screaming, shouting, all that stuff, secrecy. The tomb is a big circle. You get into a fake tomb in front of all of your brethren. Your brother's under the skin now, and then you're reborn. So you become initiated.
Yeah,
and you have to keep serious. You can't even talk about it. So
and I would say to some extent that if you can even get these people to believe there's something there, you enhance the effect of whatever you're going for too. So yeah, I've always tried to conceptualize this in a way that doesn't have to, because then there's a lot of people who like. I mean, I know there's a lot of people in this realm that I'm not religious particularly, and I know you are, and so but it is like I do try to conceptualize it for people who aren't, how this would make sense.
I wouldn't say I'm that religious, frankly. I have definitely religious beliefs.
Yeah.
But like religious to me is a vague term, because Crowley was very religious. Yeah. He was actually a very rigid doctrinaire religion, but his religion was Satanism and occultism. And he would literally do what's called the Liber Resh, which is a sun adoration, and he would make his followers do it 3 times a day on the dot, like noon, morning, and night. And so he would stop and adore the sun, so he was I think he was very religious in his practices, and he was always dedicated to the occult. He never changed.
Yeah, I guess I try to understand, because I do think sometimes in these sorts of environments, these groups, that there are people who do try to take it from a pragmatic way and just use it to pursue power. And there are probably those that are true believers as well. So, and I just think that might be a good way to understand it. It's almost a religion of power. So, yeah.
I think so. I think you could term that in any religion. I've seen Muslims who say they're Muslim, but they're just as normal, like the same as any Western teen or something. Yeah. So then there's very strict Muslims, very strict Jews, very strict Christians, very strict occultists. And then there's the guys who just got into it for whatever reason, whether, like you said, power, sex, drugs, freedom, whatever freedom. Maybe they were more like Crowley. Some people have surmised that because of his strict upbringing, it was a form of rebellion that felt good to kind of he said he wanted to be Satan's chief of staff.
Yeah. So he also was given a ton of money from a young age and was basically like
incredible sum of money. He had no concept of money. He never worked a day in his life, literally from birth to death. So he had no concept of a 9-to-5 job or working for somewhere else. And that is a real head changer. I've seen people like that. Like George Bush Sr. is the same way. Like never worked a day in his life. And that he ties into this book later on. My first book, Prophet of Evil. But he went in to buy something at a shopping mall a store when he was 50, and he looked at the checkout counter and was freaked out. He didn't understand the scanning system. He had never seen the red light barcode scanning system. He was like he saw a UFO or a Bushman of the Kalahari finding a Coke bottle in the middle of the desert. Like, wow, this is amazing. Like, this is what we do every day, George. He had no clue. So he just probably, like Crowley, he even admitted, I just went to the bank and called my banker and they gave me money for whatever I wanted to do. So he burned through his family's money by the time he was 45 and then kind of had to beg. But the amount of money was off the chart, $20 million today's numbers or something.
Yeah, I mean, making it to your 40s on not ever actually having to produce anything ever is pretty impressive. But yeah, he was given a large sum of money and was told he was, God's best little boy essentially throughout life. And I think that it's not that crazy, I guess. And then obviously the trauma that we talked about from the beginning.
Look at these people, the upper class. Like, it's not that far away. King George or King Charles III, right? Prince Charles. He never does anything. There's pictures of him. Like, the guy has his pen. He put the pen down. He has his servant take it away. He can't move the pen from one part of his desk to another. Like, imagine what that does to you. Like, you think you're like a god or something, And that's what Crowley advocated. Like, there's no God but man. So, So I think the average person in the United States, they're not around landed aristocracy, whereas people in the UK still are. And the whole thing that props up Charles III is the landed kind of aristocracy going all the way back to William the Conqueror in 1066. It's incredible.
Yeah. Well, before I threw you off track, we were in the early days of his magical adventures, essentially.
Right. So it's the Golden Dawn. And then he kind of meets this woman, Kelly. It's a sister of one of his friends who would be his friend forever. And they travel. So he's also traveling and going on these trips. He goes to he wants to travel the biggest mountains that are on the Tibetan area in India. When India is a part of the British Empire, right? One is called Chogo-ri and the other is Kanchenjunga. So he'll make the trip from England, boat to wherever, Egypt, and then travel another boat. All the time reading and writing his poetry and stuff. On one of the trips back in 1904, he had this experience. He said it was the most important experience of his life, where his wife said he actually went into the king's chamber in the big pyramid, right? The main pyramid of the three pyramids in Cairo, today's Cairo. And then had some religious experience in April, I think 10th, 11th, 12th of 1904, and received this book from a being over his shoulder that he called the Book of the Law. And it's broken down into 3 parts, and it became the kind of centerpiece of Thelema. Now, whether he came out of his consciousness, some people have said it's very similar to kind of Nietzschean writing. Anyway, he kind of convinced people that this was a discarnate entity who was trying to get this information into humanity. He later on would say, he would call this entity Awaz, which kind of translates to Lord of the Air, which people who know the Bible know that. And then he would later say in Magic and Theory Practice that it was Satan, right? The Satan of this part of you. I mean, there's a long thing in my book where he admits it.
And Awaz isn't the one that's the gray looking thing, right? That was a different entity,
that's
right?
From the Alamantra working. He called that one Lamb. That was 1918.
Yep.
In the United States, believe it or not, that was in New York City. So that's the Alamantra working. But so then he has this book of the Law. I have pictures of it in my doc. I have a documentary about Crowley too, Prophet of Evil, which you can see on Patreon. But you can see pictures of the original. It looks like it's automatic writing. And then he put that into a book. And all these phrases became centerpieces of his religion. So you'll see phrases like those who are of us are of the number 11. So you see the 11 interspersed there. There's no God but man. Also, the slave shall serve. So all these things that may have come from his subconscious. Anyway, so the Book of the Law, Then he kind of comes back. Rose Kelly is her name. She goes insane from alcohol dementia, and he moves on to other women. And he will have these women he uses as his kind of magical partners. And he goes now by the name the Beast from the Book of Revelation. And his magical women, there'll be about 11 or 12. They will all be known as the Scarlet Women, and they will be his consorts. And it's almost like he's sucking the life out of them.
Yeah.
And he's like really like, he also kind of comes to this conclusion around this time at the turn of the century, after doing a lot of ritual magic, that the use of drugs and sex in rituals augments their power. So he kind of brings into this realm sex magic, along with other people in Germany. This other group, the OTO, which some people are close to the Nazis. It's pretty another side story. Crowley will become head of the Ordo Templi Orientis in 1925. So basically, so he starts using drugs, heavy drugs, a lot of cocaine, anhelonium they called it back then, which is basically mushrooms.
Was it at this point where he was using, I guess, his magic in general, or I don't know if it was his sex, or how you would conceptualize it? But this is when he was essentially trying to do the worst things possible because he was the Beast. So this is like you mentioned, sucking the lives out of the woman. So this would be doing essentially the most degrading acts you could possibly think of. Is this that type of thing? Okay.
Yeah, transgression was power, so it was a form of power, and it becomes really bad. And some of the stuff people have discovered recently, like the people who like Crowley keep this stuff quiet, but excrement eating, child rape, blood drinking. He would take the Scarlet Women, and they have pictures of them, and brand them like a cow. So he brand them on their chest with something that he called the mark of the beast. So just like from the Book of Revelation. So he's trying to like fulfill the Book of Revelation. Mark of the beast is like a mix of like solar and phallic kind of imagery. So he had this kind of idea of solar phallus kind of things.
Yeah, and with the kiddo stuff, I mean, when I looked into it, it seemed to be that people tried to steer away from that, almost as if it wasn't as credible. What's the deal with that? Because I mean, I just, it's from my understanding,
we can get to that. Basically,
confirmed.
he had these two women. He eventually Rose Kelly goes crazy, and he runs into a woman, Leah Hersig, who's young. You can see the before and after Crowley pictures of her. She's young and cute at one point, I think. And then at the end, she looks like she saw a ghost. Very tight eye, like drawn and just out of it. She ended up becoming a prostitute in the street. He abandoned her to prostitution in France. And then there was another woman he ran in. Shumway was her name, and they had kids. And so he thought when he was at the Abbey of Thelema in Sicily that people should be exposed to sexual behavior. And then he was always kind of, like I said, like he was religious. So he was a very doctrinaire, and he said, you have to have kind of like this magic book where you record everything you're doing so that you can go back and look. So you had these magical, very ornate magical records that Crowley would take. He kind of questioned his sanity because he would write all kinds of stuff in there. And so you have this magical record of the Beast book that isn't really a core book of his. It's almost like a diary. And in there, he makes all these crazy statements. I'm the greatest person who've ever lived. I hate myself. Like it's almost like somebody who's like almost schizo. And then there's a writing in there where he says, the Scarlet Woman let me have her 2-year-old child. And, it gets really graphic. But it's hard to get away from that because it was often overlooked. And a lot of the Crowley, they have it's just like anybody. Like if they have their own hero, they don't want to know these dark things.
I mean, as dark as it is, I mean, like with my understanding of his belief system, that only makes sense, really. Like that was.
He said total freedom, so you can do whatever you want. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of law. So there, I mean, if that's your religion, then that means whatever you can do. So there's a lot of that's why the gay movement, the founder of the gay movement, was influenced by Crowley. What was his name? I mean, that's the whole, people wouldn't know that, but like this Harry Hayes, his name, was actually a homosexual revolutionary.
Yeah.
So you can trace some of this stuff to today, this transgenderism and stuff like that, to back through Crowley for sure. He called Satan like the Pandrogyne. So not just an androgen, but like a mix of gender and androgyny.
Mm-hmm.
And Crowley was like that too, bisexual, whatever. So I think that you see that there's an overlap between this crazy stuff that's happening in the United States, this culture, and Crowley, no question.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we were at where he's first starting to experiment with sexuality and drugs and mixing it all together type deal.
So he starts he's traveling again. He goes to Kanchenjunga. He makes a name for himself as a real piece of work and gets kind of banned from the international mountaineering group. Somebody fell. He refused to help them. He didn't take part in it. Kind of wrecked his, nobody wanted him back on an expedition again, even though he had money. So he was kind of justly and rightly, in my mind, kicked out. There's very interesting pictures of him from these ascents. He never made it to the top of Kanchenjunga. He ended up going to Mexico to hike their biggest mountains, and eventually comes back to England. He starts his own kind of religious order called the Silver Star, or it's translated to, there's like a Latin name I can't remember offhand. Anyway, eventually they sense the World War I is gearing up, and he comes to America on the Lusitania, right? So it was the Lusitania, eventually when it got sank, that's what brought the United States into the war. But he was brought in. There's a really good book. It's called Secret Agent 666. And it's about Crowley in the U.S., in New York City. He stayed at One Washington Place. So right in the center of Manhattan at a really nice hotel. And associated with all the elites here and traveling around too. So he wasn't just stuck in New York. He would go up to Esopus Island, which is up the Hudson River, New Hampshire, travel to Detroit, through San Francisco, Florida. He actually wrote something while he was in New Orleans called The Green Lady or Green Woman or something like that. It was about that drink, that the green drink people drink. I forgot the name of it now. But anyway, so he's in New York City. He's spying. He integrates himself with the kind of German. The Germans and the English were always fighting to get America on their side for World War I and II. And Crowley's job, according to his own admission, he ends up writing this biography that's very long. It's like 500 or 600 pages. It only goes up to like his life until he was 44. But he writes a lot of stuff about who he knew, who end up turning out to be intelligence agents. And he integrates himself into two pro-German newspaper, the Fatherland and the International, and writes for them. He also writes for like known publications today, Vanity Fair. So he has articles in the original Vanity Fair from 100 years ago. So he's constantly, I would call him a literateur, which is he writing books, plays, fiction, nonfiction, articles, poems. But he's there, so he's integrated himself. The U.S. gets into the war. The Lusitania gets sunk. The U.S. comes into the war on the side of the English. And Crowley says, my work is done, and goes back to the U.K. And he gets let into the U.K., which is interesting because he always goes back to the U.K. and they never arrest him for any of the crazy stuff he's up to. So he stays there. He's also goes to Paris at that time. Paris was actually known as the City of Lights. It's a dump now. It's actually a fourth world dump or a third world dump, like a lot of the cities in the West have like going down the tubes, anti-civilizational. But back then it was a place where people used to go to. So people of all the elites would go to of the West, from the U.S., the UK, Hemingway. They would go and spend time in Paris at these kind of salons and cafes and write and associate with each other. So Crowley was part of that. And eventually, before that, he was in, I think it was, no, so he was directed by some entity he called the Wizard to start a magical kind of like Hogwarts, right? He called it the Abbey of Thelema, which is in, he selected, it was in Sicily, right? So, and he invited people to come there and train. And so he decorated the inside with murals and paintings and put a ceremonial magic thing on the floor. And he was there for 3 years, and he got kicked out on the orders of Mussolini. He heads back to Paris. So he get kicked out of Italy by the fascists, like the real fascists, that when they came to power. There was kind of like on the West, people were they were smitten by fascism. It doesn't have the bad word, like the literal
Mhm.
fascist, not some big
Yeah.
left-wing person using that term.
Yeah.
But they thought that maybe it was a good form of politics.
Yeah, the government corporate merger fascism.
Well,
Not
the
the
U.S.
nonsense, yeah.
is fascist writ
Yep.
large. I mean, these guys could know Mussolini and Hitler and some of these other characters in Britain. They got nothing on these guys today. They've outdone they did. People just can't see it when it's right in front of their face.
Oh, 100%. And I am noticing as you're mentioning this, it does remind me today of like influence ops as well, which and then also I mean I can only surmise it feels like they're it wouldn't be that crazy if this also was a little bit of a blackmail op. And I'm not saying op in the sense this is all fake. I mean this could obviously he could earnestly believe all this, but then also be hey, I also have a there's also a side mission type deal here. So
Yes,
yeah.
I think you're right. But I think that people question Crowley's authenticity, and it's something that comes up in a lot of my discussions and a lot of questions. Is Crowley really an occultist, or is this a cover? Is that his cover? Because I think that really, when you look at him and his life and his arc, I think he was dedicated all the way to the end, even when he wasn't in an op. Like, why would you maintain the ruse? Why wouldn't
Yeah.
you just come back and retire and find go to a farm and do something? He stayed with it all the way to the end, and he was interested in carrying on and moving on. This guy McMurtry, who I write about in Children of the Beast, went and visited Crowley when he was at his kind of retirement home in Hastings, and he's Crowley screaming at the carolers, "Get out of here! I hate you!" and still talking. And there's a book that was compiled of Crowley's kind of letters, his missives to people interested in magic. It's called Magic Without Tears. And even at the latter part of his life, where he's old, decrepit, heroin addict with asthma, he takes his time to write these people and direct them about magic. So why would you do that if you're an intel agent? Like, it doesn't make any sense. And also, he was carrying on, like, he's influenced Wicca and Gardnerian Wicca, who knew Crowley. So there's a lot of different things going on, and he's clearly writing for the future. Like, he wasn't really recognized as much in his own life, but now, like, everybody, like in Hollywood, Crowley's huge. Like, sex magic and all that stuff is real.
Mm.
But anyway, so he gets kicked out of the Abbey of Thelema, goes back to France, hangs out with his buddy Harris, who's kind of another kind of edgy at that time, very edgy writer. So these are kind of like back then, like today's like society, like people would probably have heart attacks if they saw how nasty things are today. But back then, like literature, like it was Lady Chatterley's Lover was really scandalous. And so Crowley was hanging out with those types, these kind of like avant-garde types. It's there that he starts, I mean, he's doing all kinds of magical practices. If we go back to New York, he does these workings. He had the Gerensis working, the Alamantra working. He had the Abramelin working in Loch Ness at his place up there. 1918, he does the Alamantra working. These are things, magical workings. He takes place over time. He writes about it. He has this entity shows up. It looks like the big gray alien. Like, it's incredible.
So the workings are like a big magical process, like a
Correct.
big what's the word I'm looking for?
It's kind of like almost like a theatrical thing where he's doing it over time with a purpose, with an outcome, and recording the whole thing. So you can type in right now the Alamantra working on Google, and you'll see all his writings about it, or the Gerensis, all these other places. And it's hard to keep track because he's moving around a lot. Like, he's in Algeria. He contacts this demon Choronzon, supposedly, with this other guy, Newberg, who ends up going insane. And like, they summon it through sex magic. It's really heavy. Anyway, so 1918 on to France. He's doing something called what's the right way to put it? It's basically he's been engaged in sex magic. He needs to have servitors. He's with Harris, and this is supposedly when Pauline Pierce shows up. And Pauline Pierce is supposedly the mother of Barbara Pierce, who later became Barbara Bush, who looks like Crowley. So the timing kind of overlaps. And she was actually kind of like Crowley. She was an elitist who wanted to go to France and hang out, and they would hang out with these, crazy people. They thought it was fun. That broke the tension. It was like that when Crowley was in New York. So a lot of elite people were around him. So that's the rumor. It's called Errado ECL, Errado comatose lucidity is what he called it. And there's a lot of pretty gnarly details about that. But
Are most of these workings him trying to commune with some sort of entity? Because that seems to be a commonality. Is that a through line for all of them, or is that just is that just some of them?
it depends what he's doing, because he believed in astral travel, so he believed he could leave his body and communicate with people. So that would be one thing. There were certain things where he was always try to contact Iwas again. So like, I see Iwas up on the rocks here, right? Or I had Iwas tell me this. Or he would also kind of go into other realms. He did something. He basically did John Dee, right? Remember John Dee from the 16th century, Elizabethan England, did these kind of magical workings like that. He was really a magician, or whatever you want to call it. But it was Dee and Kelly, actually, interesting. So he had this kind of like, he was the magician, and then you had a scryer. Very similar to what Joseph Smith did, actually, believe it or not. That's it's actually not a side story, because Crowley admired Smith, and it makes perfect sense, because it was one magician to another, in my opinion.
Yeah,
Smith.
that is. Yeah.
And you can go. Crowley did the same thing: seer stones, hats, trying to go, and somebody writing stuff down. That's what Dee and Kelly did. So you see these kind of weird overlaps in history that you think may not be connected. But anyway, he did the Enochian magic. It's called the Enochian magic of Dee, where you kind of contact things on different aethers, Aethyr, which is almost kind of like a different plane, maybe is a way to put it. Dimension.
Yeah, Aether's usually, I mean, I don't know if it works here, but usually it's supposed to be like another plane to where you can draw energy from. This is where people usually get perpetual energy ideas from, is something like an Aether idea. So
yeah, and actually some scientists believe the Aether really exists. Like, they believe it. I mean, it's not just in magic. Which, could be.
Which in theory, I guess that would make magic a possibility. If there is another dimension that has essentially infinite power, or at least power that we can pull from in some way. I mean, that would make, I mean, I guess it's science in a way, but to anyone else that would look like magic.
Right, you could say it's a science, I mean, I think from a Christian perspective, you have to believe in heaven or a spirit realm. Like, that's basically the whole thing, where Christ is getting
and hell
information, and hell, and all this stuff. So you have to believe in dimensions or planes or whatever you want to call it. Yeah. Sometimes it's just you're arguing about terms. You mean the same thing. Anyway, so he did that. He's doing all kinds of different magic. He's then goes to France. He gets kicked out of France too, I think in 28, for spying, like literally for spying. He limps back to limps back to England again. Then he ends up in Weimar, Germany, before Hitler comes to power. So it's a really interesting time of Crowley, and a lot of destabilizations going on in Germany at the time, because it's right after, the stock market crash and all this stuff. So he's there from 30 to 33. Hitler comes to power, and Crowley leaves. And then he kind of goes back, and he has these lawsuits. He's trying to get money. He's broke. He works on his own tarot cards. So you can see the Thoth deck, Thoth. And some of his lawsuits, he's trying to like weasel money out of people and sue people for defamation. And then he ends up in his last kind of leg of his life at this kind of upscale boarding house in Hastings, which is in the south of England, and then dies in 47. Before he dies, like I said, he wrote this book, Magic Without Tears, and also said, before Hitler was, I am, which is kind of an interesting statement. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Like, Crowley appreciates a magician one to the other, right? And Hitler, you have to see Hitler as a magician. He says all great liars are great magicians. That's one of Hitler's quotes. And you can read Children of the Beast, where it's reading a lot of like magical books, very similar to Magic and Theory and Practice, actually, in German. Hitler's doing that. So 47, like he dies. There's like stuff in the papers from his death. And interestingly, a thing about Crowley is that he liked the attention from the papers. So you can go back through newspapers in the U.S. and see so many articles about Crowley, his life, the Abbey of Thelema, really artful pictures that are, very well drawn, black and white pictures, art. So people were interested in him all over the world. And I think that's how we got followers, was this kind of notoriety. and they called like John Bull, which was kind of like a rag from the time. They would call him like the world's most wickedest man. He loved it. Like he thought it was great. It was great publicity.
Yeah.
So that's Crowley kind of in a nutshell. There's a lot more details, a lot more books, a lot more, like he wrote Magic in Theory and Practice, which is really kind of a go-to guide for magic for anyone. And almost every major magician or an occultist has a Crowley phase, whether they adapt Crowley, whether they become Crowley followers, whether they reject Crowley. Almost all the chaos magicians and all these kind of nouveau Order of Nine Angles, Temple of Set, Temple of Satan, they've all read Crowley.
So I mean, obviously, you know, we've kind of covered him in a nutshell. But before we wrap out of here, I would like to kind of get your thoughts on kind of his legacy into today and how he's affected today. I do find it interesting that you know, as we kind of parse out here, that it's almost as if this is like a religion of the elite, or a religion of espionage, a religion of intel. You could almost make parallels to there being ops, and some of this stuff is magic being indistinguishable for an op. It's the same exact thing, but an op, but adding in woo woo. And you can have true believers, as we kind of made the point here in somebody like Crowley himself being a true believer. And if anything, that adds more power to it, I think, in a certain sense, because I mean, he's a fervent believer in this, and essentially it has the same exact effect as an op, and you know, is essentially an op described in religious terms. So I think there's something interesting to be said there, and maybe that may play out in how it's understood today and how we're seeing it in today's you know, landscape.
I think that's very well said. And it's interesting you use the word indistinguishable, because Arthur C. Clarke's three kind of general rules, the third rule is any exhibition of high technology is indistinguishable from magic. So like he says indistinguishable. So 9/11, if you think it like Crowley and this kind of magic isn't real, or it's not real, there's a magical component to 9/11, which all the dates 11/11/11/11. So if you read my book, my book is really outgrowth from 9/11. It's not from reading Crowley. I had to go back to Crowley to understand 9/11, why they chose the dates, why everything had to be set up like a ceremonial magicians thing. All the dates had to be right. The temple had to be right. The World Trade Center had to be right. The day had to be right. George Bush Sr. had to give that famous New World Order speech 11 years to the day of 9/11. So in their minds, they're calculating all this stuff. And it's got to be this whole internal power trip of getting it all right. So when you see, like I've studied other satanic events, that's what these guys, people, you got to be in the right environment with the right magical implements on the right date at the right time with a full moon, with all this other stuff. So 9/11 has all that stuff put together and really thought out. So if people think that magic is kind of a relic of the past or John Dee or something like that.
Well, I mean, I made the point about espionage. Espionage is magic, if you think about it. Like, you know, just say, for example, was it Sirhan? Like, if you think about that circumstance with RFK, like what happened there, that kind of was, if you're like me and you're someone who doesn't believe the official narrative, they pulled off fucking magic. If you look at MK Ultra, like they were trained by magicians. They like espionage, like the intel agencies were taught sleight of hand. Like it is, in a sense, if you think about what espionage is, in what way is that really meaningfully different from magic, you know?
They literally had a trained magician from the UK on their payroll, which is a whole nother story. But yeah, if you go back and look at the signing of the National Security Agreement in 47, Truman is signing it, and behind him are 4 members of Skull and Bones. They have to just be guffawing back at Yale, like laughing at this Midwestern rube assigning power to them. And he actually, after JFK was shot, he published something a month later in the Washington Post saying, wow, this was a big mistake. Basically, the whole gist of his article was he realized that he had made a mistake by giving these, because the actual original NSA of the CIA was not supposed to be operational. It's supposed to be an intelligence gathering, but they had other things planned. So they basically got money from the state. I mean, it's just an incredible thing where you can get money from the government taxpayer dollars to pull off all kinds of stuff. Really global revolution. You have to see like all the overthrows of these governments over and the installation of other people and convincing people to think that it isn't constructed or magical working, but it's kind of happening naturally when they're puppeteering the whole thing. Like they installed Saddam Hussein, they installed people in Syria, Iran, Chile, Arbenz in Guatemala. I mean, they ran Mexico. Almost all the CIA ran all the Mexican prime ministers. I mean, it's incredible stuff they got away with. And all to the and Italy. I mean, you can just go through the whole list. But
it's magic.
It's magic, and I think that really that's just the political thing. Crowley had political aims. That's one thing people don't realize maybe when they think about it. But he, like I said earlier, he believed that feudalism was optimal. So I think that you see there these other kind of American aristocrats, Rockefellers, Dulles, unrepentant about their ideas. They think they should rule. And so people who like disturb those rules are seen. Robert F. Kennedy said he was a revolutionary. MLK wanted just a little bit of power. And these guys were like, yeah, no, you're not going to get any of that. We're going to kill you. And they did. The 60s was a freaking bloodbath. And a lot of magic, a lot of hypnotism, which is Crowley knew about hypnotism. We can go through all that stuff, but it's really something else. Like all the people that Crowley influenced, Arthur C. Clarke, the whole Manson family, Bouzoulet, Friends with Anger, Timothy Leary, Jimmy Page, Jodorowsky, Geiger, like influence Alien. This guy's a full-on Crowley lover. Jim Morrison knew it. The Beatles, Rolling, Bowie. I mean, it's like who isn't influenced by him? So it's pretty remarkable.
Well, I think we did a pretty good little primer on Crowley here. I think that's about as good as we can get. I guess I'll pass it off to you. Is there anything you feel like we should have included for a quick little primer for anyone to kind of get a quick little understanding of Crowley? Obviously, past this, they should probably go check out your podcast or your books.
Yeah, they can check my books. If you're a more visual learner, you can go to my Patreon, and I have like a 2-hour documentary on Crowley, Prophet of Evil. A lot of kind of pictures of him. And I also have made a book. I don't really publish it that much. It's called Aleister Crowley, A Visual Study. It's like $5 or something on Kindle. You can check that out. It's not kind of like one of my major works. My other book is Prophet of Evil. It's really a bio of Crowley. But you can get more details and more people who are interested. Like Crowley's not that far, like two people away from Hitler. Like his buddy, JFC Fuller, who he talked to all the time, was one of only 2 Englishmen invited to Hitler's 50th birthday. So it's hard to believe Hitler didn't know about Crowley. But yeah, there's a lot of information maybe people don't know. He definitely was not a dabbler, Crowley, and I think that his influence is kind of like a subterranean or sub rosa, under the table influence, where a lot of people believe in his ideas, but they won't come out and say it publicly. So,
well, I appreciate you coming on, really, William. I know we kind of already plugged a little bit, but if you want to let people know about your podcast, your books, or whatever you want to let them know, tell them about you got coming up, or
yeah, I'm just busy working my podcast. I have over 1,300 episodes. I've done really got my start as a guest talking about Crowley in 2010. So you can go back and listen to some of those earlier interviews that I've done from like 15 years ago. It's hard to believe. But that's William Ramsey Investigates. It's in the top 0.5% podcast in the world. So it's doing pretty good. And yeah, my books are available on Amazon, and just keep pumping out episodes. Like I did one this morning, and talking to one of your buddies again next week. So,
yeah.
Austin Picard. So
nice.
We're probably going to do this whole Mockingbird series. It depends how much
parts on it.
Yeah,
I'm
it's really up to him.
Deep into a Watergate series with him.
Yeah,
right now,
I think we could do like 20 episodes on that alone. We keep doing these hour and a half shows, and it's like we didn't even get into any of the deeper things. We're just like, wow, there's a lot to talk about there. So anyway, it's great to be with you again, and thanks for the invite.
Yeah, well, for those who want to support what I'm doing, you can do that over at patreon.com/NoWayJose2020. The lowest level is $2. The highest level is my sponsors, but the lowest level, you get the early access to the episodes. Like this episode right here, you would get about a week early as opposed to the public. And the $2 level, you also can be a talking head in the call-in portion of Already Dead, which is my live stream show I do every Tuesday at 9:30 with Austin Picard, the individual we just mentioned. And the highest level of my sponsors, I read them off every episode as a thanks. I have my co-host and Tower Gang at Tower Gang Toad, at Abrogate D's, at ZOVERACK, at _Infinite Zeal. And then Jacob Daniel of the Biblical Anarchy podcast. You can follow him at Biblical Anarchy. Then Tim Tuttle, you can follow him at Jolly Young Klebo. He's actually who made the edit at the beginning of the episode today. And we have Will Bell, who makes a delicious blueberry rabbit eye wine. And then a big fan of the show at Real Josh Elliott and Torrin May. Thank you guys for supporting what I do and helping me keep doing it. And thank you for joining us today, William. And thank you to the audience for popping along. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. And you can follow me on Twitter at TowerGangJose. See you guys next time. Bye.